Confirming that you can hear me since this is a new format for us.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. All right, well, welcome everyone to our final webinar of the year. It's great to see so many of you able to join us for our virtual Lunch and Learn or Latte and Learn webinar, the fourth in the series for this year, and really depends on what time zone you're in, but hope you've got some delicious whole grain bread on hand, or I'm not sure what sort of latte involves whole grains, but someone I'm sure will figure that out. In any case, I am absolutely delighted to be focusing today on the Menus of Change principle of making whole intact grains the new norm. I personally am a bit of a whole grains fanatic. My master's thesis worked on that a bit, and I consume a variety of whole grains on a regular basis. And I can say honestly that our two speakers today are among those rare individuals out there who are probably equally fanatical about whole grains. So you're in for a real treat. And just as a brief background about the Menus of Change principle itself, really it's calling for a cultural shift away from the emphasis on refined flour and an embrace of the great diversity of grains, particularly those that are intact grains, ancient grains, and so forth, but also really bringing culinary innovation forward to improve the appeal of whole grain flours and the different dishes that they can be incorporated into. So huge opportunity in the realm of intact whole grains, from salads, soups, side dishes, breakfast dishes, and really runs the gamut from brown rice to oats to quinoa and beyond. So I will leave it to our expert speakers to give you the lowdown, but for those of you who are new, the way we usually run this is about 30 minutes of presentation at the beginning, and then we turn it over to audience Q&A. And really, it's not only Q&A, but discussion. We'd love to hear from members as well as sponsor representatives who have great examples to share, lessons learned, things like that. So really, this is all about peer learning and mining the incredible amount of knowledge and experience that exists within the collaborative. So just a quick housekeeping note, this is a webinar format, which is a little bit different from what we used last time around. So if you wish to participate in, either share something or have a question, ask a question, we ask that you use the little raise hand button. If you look on the side, right-hand side panel, there's a gray button that says raise hand. So that's what we're going to be using once we get to the Q&A portion. We'll walk you through. We'll make sure that everyone's able to chime in and participate. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, who actually will be Jackie Bertoldo. So Jackie's the Assistant Director of Food Choice Architecture at R&DE Stanford Dining. She's a resident nutrition and behavior change expert there. And in that role, she really translates the latest evidence to develop innovative food and educational programs for all of those diners throughout the Stanford community. She's an active member of MCORC and the Research Working Group, now in the newly formed Nutrition and Sustainability Committee, and she oversees, at Stanford, she oversees not only nutrition education, marketing outreach for Eat Well, but also food allergy and menu labeling programs. Jackie is a registered dietitian nutritionist. She has a master's degree in public health as well as a degree in exercise science. So really, one of those amazing people who is qualified to tell us all about the why behind this principle of making whole intact grains the new norm. Jackie, take it away.
Thank you, Sophie. So I am going to talk to everyone today a little bit about what whole grains are. What do we mean when we're saying whole grains? I'm going to highlight a few of the most common whole grains, some of our favorites here at Stanford, and then go into a little bit of myth-busting, some questions that we often get from students, information that I think will be helpful if you're trying to promote whole grains on your own campus. So to begin with, what are whole grains? Well, the simple answer is that whole grains are grasses. They're a member of the grass family that produce a dry, one-seeded fruit called a kernel. And whole grains, grains in general, are central components of some of the most healthful food cultures in the world. So for instance, the Mediterranean diet, the Japanese, and traditional Nordic diets. Rice, maize, and wheat in particular make up about 2/3 of the world's food energy intake. So grains provide life-sustaining food to over 4 billion people across the world every single day. So what are the components of whole grains? The whole grain, when it is being grown, typically is surrounded by a hull or husk, which is the inedible outer shell or coating of the grain. So you may all have heard of a corn husk, and that actually is a true husk. And I'll talk a little bit about corn later and why it's both a grain and a vegetable. So some grains have husks, others like barley have inedible hulls that adhere really tightly to the grain kernel. And the hull or the husk has to be removed through either hulling or curling in order to get to the actual grain that we would eat. And curling is a method of scraping off the hull very quickly and easily and inexpensively, but they don't take care in curling to actually preserve the full bran. So most of the bran is actually scraped off with the hull. So if you see curled grains, know that some or all of the bran has actually been removed during processing. And the bran is the outer skin of the edible grain that is really rich in nutrients and fiber. Hulling, which is another way to remove the hull, takes more care in preserving most of the bran. So choosing hulled grains over pearled grains will offer the most nutritional benefits. Then we get to the endosperm, which is actually the food supply for the kernel. It provides energy for the plant and is primarily composed of starches with a little bit of protein. And then we have the germ, which is the embryo that can actually sprout a new plant. So this is really dense in vitamins, minerals, and healthy fats. So when we talk about whole grains, we're talking about the endosperm, the germ, and the bran, or products like flour that are made from all three of those components. Refined grains, on the other hand, are missing one or more of the bran, the endosperm, or the germ. So white flour and white rice contain only the endosperm, so the very starchy part. And that, unfortunately, strips the kernel of much of its fiber, much of its nutrients, and the healthy fats from the germ. And so because modern milling technology makes it easy to remove the bran and the germ, it's led to widespread use of refined grains and white flour. But because refined grains are devoid of most nutrition, the US government actually requires that some refined grains, like most flours, be artificially enriched with vitamins and minerals. So when you see the nutritional label, you may see vitamins and minerals in there, but they've been artificially added after the fact. So to begin talking about some of the different varieties of whole grains, we'll start with wheat, which is probably one of the most familiar to all of you. Humans began cultivating wheat more than 17,000 years ago in the area that is now Iraq. And today, it's the second most popular grain crop in the world. And about 3/4 of all US grain products are made from wheat flour. There's actually 6 classes of wheat and thousands and thousands of varieties. So I've listed a few for you here. Some of them include durum, semolina, einkorn, spelt, kamut, farro. These are all various versions of wheat. Along with barley and rye, wheat contains a protein called gluten that can trigger severe inflammation for a small genetically susceptible part of the population with an autoimmune condition called celiac disease, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. But as you're well aware, whole wheat grains can be made into pilaf. They make an excellent base for rice bowls. You can also use whole grain bread to create a toastation or incorporate whole grain pasta into your menu rotation. The next grain I'll talk about is rice. So rice was domesticated 10,000 to 14,000 years ago in the Pearl River Valley region of China. It is the second highest grain in worldwide production, and it grows on every continent except Antarctica. More than 40,000 varieties of rice exist, and the US grows over 100 varieties commercially, which provides about 12% of the world rice trade. And rice is gluten-free. It can be eaten on its own, great as a pilaf. You can also use it to make risotto or even a breakfast porridge, which is really common in many Asian cuisines. Barley was one of the first cultivated grains, likely was the first domesticated. usually, or typically, we associate barley in similar applications to wheat. It is the fourth most important cereal crop. And one of the reasons for that is that it is the key ingredient in beer and whiskey production. So most of the barley that's produced actually goes towards that as opposed to being eaten. The origin of oats is debated, but likely occurred in the Mediterranean. For most of history, oats were actually considered a weed. And in the US, most oat production goes to animal feed, and less than 5% is actually used for food. Most commonly, the oat kernels are cut into pieces or flattened and steamed to help speed up cooking. So these are often called rolled or old-fashioned oats. The steel-cut oats are actually the entire oat kernel that's been halved or quartered to allow the kernel to absorb water more efficiently. And oats are of note because they are particularly high in a soluble fiber called beta-glucan that has been associated with a host of benefits, particularly around cardiovascular health. And oats are also gluten-free. However, I put an asterisk there because a lot of times during the processing of the oat kernel, they are either grown in areas where there are wheat crops or they're manufactured and processed in facilities that have wheat. And so if someone actually has celiac disease and needs to avoid wheat, you need to look for actually gluten-free certified oats. But naturally, they don't contain gluten. Oats are a great breakfast staple. You can use them to make a porridge, granola. We also use it as a topping for some of our fruit-forward desserts. The next grain, teff, is honestly one of my personal favorites. It's becoming more and more popular in the United States. It originated and is grown predominantly in the Ethiopian Empire, which is located in the Horn of Africa, and is the highest in minerals of the grain, particularly calcium and iron. And thanks in part to its consumption by elite endurance athletes, teff is becoming a lot more popular in the US. It's also gluten-free, and teff flour can be used as a substitute for regular flour in baking. It's also made into a fermented flatbread called injera, which is typical of Ethiopian cuisine. Or you can use it to make a sweet or savory porridge, as one of our chefs here enjoys doing. Sorghum is another interesting grain. It was originally domesticated in Northeast Africa. It is of note because it is one of the most efficient crops in conversion of solar energy and use of water. So it's highly drought tolerant. And actually, many people don't know this, but the US is the largest producer of sorghum in the world. Yet much of our sorghum crops are used for animal feed and ethanol production, and much of the grains for food consumption are exported to other countries. Sorghum is also gluten-free, and it's great in grain bowls and stews. You can also pop it like popcorn, which is a fun thing that we did a couple weeks ago at our tasting table here. And the students really, really enjoyed trying sorghum as popcorn. So, speaking of corn, corn is also considered a grain. So, a grain is defined as the harvested dry seeds of the cereal grass. But field corn that is harvested when the seeds are dry would be considered a grain. Although sweet corn, when harvested before maturity and before the grains dry out, is considered a vegetable. So corn kernels, as in popcorn, would be considered a whole grain. It was first cultivated in southern Mexico and Central America 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, and it is the most popular grain crop. However, a lot of the corn production goes to animal feed and ethanol production. So now I'm going to talk about pseudo grains. So all the grains I just spoke with you about are whole grains, are actually grasses. Pseudo grains are also called pseudo cereals. They're seeds that are cultivated and consumed similarly to cereal grains, but they are not actually true grains. And you can even see from the pictures in the back that they look very different from the grasses that I've been showing you in previous pictures. They're actually beautiful. So the first pseudo grain I'll talk about is amaranth. So amaranth dates back to the Aztec Empire, and there's at least 60 species, 3 of them that are commercially available. In Asia, they actually eat the leaves of the plant. It's also another gluten-free grain option. Quinoa, we're all probably pretty familiar with by now. It was first cultivated 7,000 years ago by the Andean people. And another gluten-free option, quinoa protects itself from predators with a bitter coating called saponins, and these need to be rinsed off before consumption because they're very bitter. So quinoa is one that you want to make sure if you're going to be preparing it that it needs to be washed beforehand. Buckwheat is the next one I will tell you about, and despite its name, it is not related to wheat. In fact, one of its closest cousins is rhubarb. Buckwheat was first cultivated in Southeast Asia about 6,000 years ago. And some of you may have heard of a common buckwheat product called the soba noodles, the buckwheat or soba noodles. They've been eaten in Tibet and northern China for centuries. We really enjoy making dishes with soba noodles here. It's important though, even though buckwheat, the grain, is gluten-free, most of the commercially available soba noodles are not gluten-free, so it's important to check the packaging. And then last, I'm going to tell you about millet. Millet has been cultivated for about 8,000 years, most likely originated in Africa. In North America and Europe, it's primarily grown as animal feed, so it's also known commercially in the US as a component of bird feed. And 97% of millet produced in the world is from developing countries, so it's a really important crop for a lot of developing nations. Millet can be made into a porridge, it can be cooked like rice, it can be milled into flour. My favorite application is that it has the look and feel of couscous, and so it's a really good whole grain substitute for couscous. So why should we be eating more grains? Well, there's a host of health benefits. A diet that includes whole grains has been associated with reduced risk for stroke, type 2 diabetes, and heart disease. And eating whole grains may also help to regulate weight. Grains contain fiber and resistant starch that help to provide balance and sustain energy for the body. And whole grains are also a great source of B vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants. When you're talking about processing whole grains into flour, and I think Michael will talk a little bit about this in his presentation, a good way to think about it is that milling into flour is kind of like pre-digesting the grain. And so this causes it to be more easily absorbed, which contributes to a higher glycemic load of flours compared to whole intact grains. And so if you're familiar with glycemic load, it's basically the rate of which the carbohydrates from the grain are absorbed into your bloodstream and the total amount of them that are absorbed. And so milling the grain will increase the glycemic load, which means the carbohydrates will be absorbed more quickly. But on the positive side, milling actually releases some of the important nutrients that are into the grains and makes them more bioavailable for absorption. And sprouting the grains or fermenting the flour, which I know Michael is going to talk about, can actually further enhance the nutrients that are available from the flour. So quickly, I'm just going to go over a few whole grain myths. So one is that high carbohydrate foods like grains are bad for you. And when discussing carbohydrates, it's really important to distinguish between really highly processed and refined sources like sugar and flour and complex sources of carbohydrates like fruit, beans, and whole grains. Complex sources of carbohydrates have fiber and small amounts of fat and protein that can help to slow the absorption of the carbohydrates in the bloodstream. They're also really dense in vitamins and minerals, as I mentioned, and these qualities make complex carbohydrates really excellent sources of sustained energy and the nutritious addition to a balanced diet. Another thing that we hear a lot from students is that they've read that humans are not biologically adapted to eat grains. So the hypothesis goes that because grains were domesticated with the advent of agriculture some 10,000 years ago, our body has not had time to evolve to properly digest and metabolize them. But actually, more recent evidence suggests humans may have been eating grains as many as 100,000 years ago. And it's also important to note that most of the modern foods we eat were domesticated around the same time as grains. So chicken and cattle were both domesticated about 10,000 years ago. And most of the produce we eat has been naturally altered and selected in ways that make these foods almost unrecognizable to their Paleolithic counterparts. And our bodies are fully capable of digesting and metabolizing grains, and they offer a lot of nutritional benefits, as I mentioned. Another myth that I hear quite often is that grains contain anti-nutrients that make us sick. So phytates, also known as phytic acid, are chemicals that are actually found in all plant foods. They help the plant to store phosphorus. And phytates are considered an anti-nutrient because they bind minerals in the digestive tract like iron, zinc, and calcium and prevent their absorption, particularly when consumed in large amounts. But luckily, cooking, fermenting, soaking, and germinating grains inactivates much of the phytic acid, and consumption of whole grains has not been shown to adversely affect nutrient status in otherwise healthy individuals. Additionally, phytic acid is actually an antioxidant, and it appears to have a positive effect on metabolic and cardiovascular measures like blood sugar, insulin, cholesterol, and triglycerides. And dietary phytates in some research have been shown to help to inhibit the growth of certain cancer cells as well. So they may actually be beneficial for us. And then another question I get is if it says whole grain on the packaging, is the product actually whole grain? Well, food companies have learned that highlighting whole grains is a way to market these products to health-conscious consumers. So unfortunately, they often misrepresent the healthfulness of these products thanks to a marketing loophole that allows them to sprinkle a small amount of whole grain flour into their products and market them as made with whole grain. Many whole grain products like bread, pasta, tortillas are actually made with a small amount of whole grain flour mixed with white flour, but they are marketed as whole grain. So the only way to tell whether the products you're using are whole grain is to look at the ingredients list and see whether 100% whole grain flour is listed as the only source of flour. Or you can make them your own, which Michael will talk about. And then the last one I will talk about is that grains containing gluten cause digestive problems and sickness. So I mentioned that gluten is a protein found in wheat, barley, and rye. And for about 1 to 2% of the population who have a condition called celiac disease, gluten can trigger an immune response that can cause intestinal damage and severe digestive symptoms. And over the past decade, more people have begun to associate a wide variety of symptoms with gluten consumption. There's not really an understood mechanism for why gluten might trigger symptoms in individuals who test negative for celiac disease. Some emerging research actually suggests that it could be other components of foods that contain gluten that can cause these symptoms and not the gluten itself. And the majority of those in the United States who pursue a gluten-free diet say they do so because they believe it is a healthier option, but this is actually not supported by nutritional science. So if you don't have celiac disease or true gluten sensitivity, gluten-containing grains are perfectly nutritious and delicious. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Michael Pointy, who is a chef, author, and sensory scientist who specializes in all things bread. We worked with Michael here at Stanford. He did an amazing seminar last year on how to eat more bread. And his latest cookbook, How to Bake More Bread, focuses on using wild yeast and whole grains to bake really delicious bread, which I wish we were able to sample over the webinar, but I said they're absolutely delicious.
Okay. This is Sarah. I need to give him access 1 second, everyone, because I'm doing it on the computer. Okay. Michael, are you able to talk? Okay. I think we have technical difficulties. 1 second, everyone.
So while Dara is addressing the technical difficulties, does anybody have any questions about my presentation or any of the things I talked about? And Sophie, maybe you can help us facilitate the questions if fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is just a friendly reminder to use the handy raise hand feature if you do have a question. Or as mentioned, we also love to hear great menu concepts that you've tried on your campuses, or if there are any kind of ideas that you have to offer in addition to asking Jackie questions on the nutritional standpoint. I have a quick question, Jackie, which I'd love to hear your take on. One of the themes that comes through so much with your presentation and that I'm always stunned by is just the sheer variety of varietals of all of these types of grains, and yet the number that we really ever are exposed to is so small. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on what the barriers are for getting to experience greater biodiversity of grains at a commercial level in the United States, and where you've seen some areas of progress?
Well, that will require a very long answer, which we probably don't have time for, because I think biodiversity is a big issue, not just with grains, but with many of our food crops that we are only really familiar with a few varieties of each of the food crops that have thousands and thousands. And the more we reduce the biodiversity, the more at risk we are when things like disease wipe out certain strains of these crops. I know that here in California, there's a company called Community Grains who is working with farmers in California who grow heirloom varieties of wheat, and they are taking these heirloom varieties. They identify in their packaging the farmer that grew the type of wheat and what type of wheat it is, and then they transfer these products or these grains into flours and delicious pasta. And so I know that that's something that's going on here in California, really trying to introduce people to more varieties of wheat than the basic durum wheat, which is most of the pasta we eat, is that variety of wheat. So that's one thing I know that's going on. Definitely it's challenging for us to gain access to new types of whole grains because they're not very commercially available. And a lot of the grains that are coming onto the market are grown elsewhere and imported. And then even the grains that we grow here, like sorghum, we're exporting. So I think increasing awareness of the different varieties of grains, and then within each of those varieties, all of the different species, I think will help to increase the demand and therefore hopefully the production and supply.
Absolutely, I think that's a great answer in the remarkably short amount of time. I do take much hope just in the new products that are appearing or new menu items that really are either utilizing grains in different ways. For those of you who are at Menus of Change, we had a great presentation in the CIA's brewery showing the spent grains, but a whole range of grains are being increasingly, I think, commercialized both in the applications but also in the varieties. Dara, looks like you're starting to
sorry.
Are we ready for Michael, or should I keep grilling Jackie?
No, I'm just here with Jackie. But I did want to say, if Michael can hear us, I emailed him a phone number to call in because I think it's his computer that's not working. So if you can hear that, look at your email, you'll get the phone number, and then we'll be there.
Can you hear me now?
There you are.
Can you hear me?
Wonderful. Now we can.
Oh, great. Okay. Can you see me?
I'm gonna pull your slide. All right. Thank you, everyone, for holding. This technology thing is like amazing, but then it's also really difficult. So, all right, Michael, I'm going to pull up your Lavane ones. The video won't work perfectly, but you can talk over them, and I think we can see enough from them.
Actually, Dara, can we go to the one that says, excuse me, can we go to the one that says intro, flavor of grains? Did I lose time here in not being...
No, I think you're okay. So let me see.
Well, if we start with that, then that will be more fun.
Okay, is that? Hold on.
You do dinner? No, that's the second one. The first one, I believe it's called intro. I'm pretty sure it has intro in it.
Okay, I have Lavane video with the mixing. So.
No, it's not any of that. No. Exit screen. Let's go to this. It is called Intro / Flavor of Grains.
Okay. I don't have that right now.
Oh, okay. Can I show it from my end?
Yes, if you share your screen.
Can I share screen and then drag this in and do that?
Yeah.
All right. Well, here we go. Let's go. Well, it's not dragging in.
All right.
So I'm sharing my screen, and
We're getting there. Oh, we see it, the intro. If you just click on it in full screen, view it.
Intro, there it is. Hi, everyone who's listening. I'm just a poor little baker, so I apologize for not being able to do any of this. There you go. Can we see that now?
We can see it, and it's wonderful. Thank you.
That's great. All right. So, may I start? You're like, please start. All right. Well, hi, everyone.
Sorry.
Are we good? Dara, we're good?
I think you still need to enter it in full screen.
Enter in full screen. Why don't I do that?
Yes.
Perfect.
There you go. Great. Okay. So, hey, everybody. I'm Michael Calanti. I'm a bread baker and an author and a instructor in the San Francisco Bay Area. I got my chops as the director of baking education for the Cordon Bleu schools. And nowadays, I spend most of my time writing, teaching hands-on classes, and doing bakery innovation for people like Pepperidge Farm. And, well, we even did a gluten-free gingerbread cookie for the Google campus a while back. So I just want to thank Dara and Sophie and Jackie for inviting me to be part of this. And here we go. Let's go. I have to check. So, Dara, is everything good technically here?
Everything's
Dara?
good.
Everything's good. Okay, great. Okay, so here we go. All right, so I'm going to set the stage by going back 25 years ago when I first moved to California, and I came across the wine aroma wheel, which by now a lot of people are very familiar with, but I'd never seen something like this before. And so I was very intrigued. And so I went to meet Dr. Ann Noble, and she took me through the whole process. This is a detail of one of those sections, and she took me on just like the inside of how this all works. So she worked from a very generic kind of aroma, such as fruity, and then was able to extrapolate from that into different varieties of fruitiness, and then into that to more very specific ones. And of course, she undertook this with the California Wine Association as part of a marketing initiative and everything to get people to drink more California wines. And nowadays, you can pretty much see these words everywhere on labels, on Instagram. You can see these types of words. So it's very kind of common now and understood with the consumers. So my question was, what would it be like if there was something like that for bread? And so I made one. And here it is. And we can talk more about this later, but this is just a detail of it. And so again, using Ann's approach, working from the specific to from the general to the specific, I took bread into its three component parts as far as tasting goes. We have the crust on the outside. On the inside, we have what's called the crumb. And this is where you really get to tell, like, what kind of grains are in there, how the baker fermented them, etc. And then we have also the grain character, which has to do with, really what went into the process of making this. So I started teaching this to my students at the Cordon Bleu, and I really wanted to help them understand, okay, let's see if we can develop some kind of vocabulary so we can have an appreciation for tasting bread. And maybe, who knows, maybe it ends up with some sort of connoisseurship or something like that. And so here's an example of what we came up with. And the crumb, the inside of the bread, when you're eating that, there's basically a sweet and a sour taste component. And the sourness, depending on if the bread is fermented very quickly or if it's fermented over a longer period of time, the sourness can take a fruity kind of aspect, or it can take a dairy kind of sour cream, Greek yogurt kind of aspect. So working with the students more, and also with groups of sensory professionals, I was able to pull out more specific vocabulary words as to what we might find in certain kinds of breads. So, I mean, clearly these are not in all breads, but a baguette, for example, that you would make and bake the same day would have the sweet dairy notes in it, like the diacetyl, the popcorn butter, because that's a natural byproduct of quick fermentation in a white flour bread. So that's more specific than I think you need to know. But this is just a background into what I was working on. When I teach this to new students or to sensory neophytes, I really focus more on the crust, because the crust has a lot more to speak for itself than the inside of the dough, especially if you're new to tasting breads. So there's a chemical reaction called the Maillard reaction, which has to do with the browning and the caramelization of sugars and proteins and starches in various combinations on the surface of the bread. And during that reaction, there's a kind of like inverse relationship between sweetness and bitterness. And so to look at it from a baking point of view or a pastry chef point of view, these are just the colors that cooked caramel might go through. And the lesser it's cooked, as in the upper left one, the lighter, the sweeter. And certainly the darker it is, the more bitterness comes out. And I usually use the analogy of like the top of a creme brulee, for example. That bitterness, that darkness really helps accentuate the light, sweet interior of the creme brulee, the squishy, gooey, eggy part. And that's one of the things that makes that dessert such a crowd pleaser. It continues to be in the top 10. Here's some general notes that you'll find in the crust. If you're making a bread with just white flour, you're going to get really only in the crust, you're going to get sweet flavors and toasty flavors. And those are 8 and 7 on the chart there. And you can see the specific notes that you might get from that. Because with white flour, the grain has been ground, the bran, the germ are sifted out. And really, it's kind of stabilized as a commodity product, so it has long shelf life. And, for better or worse, these are the flavors that you get from that. Now, when you take whole ground grain, when you take rye kernels, or you take hard rye or hard wheat berries, and you grind them fresh, and you don't sift them and you don't oxidize them, you just put them directly into fermentation. You put them right into the starter or the yeast mixture. Well, then the bran and the germ that are still in there, they contribute flavor-wise to the other crust flavors that you find here. And the one that is really my favorite right now is the resinous quality, and and this comes when the germ is included when you grind the fresh grain into the flour, and that helps bring out that really kind of reddish, darker notes in the crusts that really give almost like a tangy kind of lingering flavor on the palate, in addition to the toasty and the sweet. And so what I found is that when you grind grain whole, when you grind it fresh and put it right into ferment, then you have access to all of these additional flavors. And Jackie will back me up I hope, in terms of like the nutritional value of that. And so let me see. And I think, there you go. So that is the end of that portion of my presentation. I have two other little things, but Dara, should I stop and take a question, or should I go right into the, I always like to take the temperature of the audience to see what's going on.
I don't know. I think why don't you do the Mizzou one next? Because why don't we do them all and then we can get questions? Let's
do them all. That's a great idea. That is a great idea. Okay, so let me close that.
In the next, like, 10 minutes for questions.
That's great. I can do that. Okay, so if I turn this on, right? I can do that. Okay, now, do we have a new slide?
Yeah, we got it.
University of Missouri. Great. Excellent. Okay. So this was a recent event that I did. This is just what they call a location slide. So everyone in the audience knows where the show is set. This is the flyer that went out for this event. And this was an invitation for agronomists from the Midwest, from the University Food Service at the University of Missouri, restaurant and bakery chefs, and even millers were in the audience. And the whole focus was, as it says there, I want to take local grains, grind them fresh, and use them. Specifically, we were using sourdough starters because that's one of the ways to really get a lot more flavor and nutrition out of the grain. Also, it as Jackie was saying, it cuts down on the phytic acid component. This is just, you know, a slide here and the menu, etc., and I'm going to talk about that. But the thing that most impressed me was that the university was able to get upper right-hand corner there, that's Josh Galliano, and he is a 3-time James Beard Award-winning chef. So he and I got together, and usually when I do a bread tasting, I bring bread and we talk about it, and maybe we put butter on it or olive oil, and maybe if everybody's good, I give them some Nutella at the end, you know. But here we had a sit-down dinner. So they brought Josh in, and he and I worked on deciphering what are the flavors that will work with all of these things. So here are some close-ups of the actual plates. So Missouri is filled with buckwheat. It's just filled with it. And so it made perfect sense to use this as the starting point. And I chose this particular format because it just really, it made a nice showmanship for Josh to like introduce his artistry on top of that. But the key to pairing a grain flavor with other foods is, well, it's the key to pairing a lot of things really, is to find the one single flavor note that is shared across the two. And in this one, it was the unique combination of umami and sweetness that buckwheat tends to bring. And so Josh took that by making a squash puree, which as he reduced it down, became very sweet and accentuated the field accents of the buckwheat. And then at the same time with the black walnuts have a real meaty, almost kind of umami flavor to them. So he caramelized them, and that brought that out. So that's the basis of what made those two work together. We went into a second course, and well, this is unique for the presentation anyway, but it's not unique to make, because wherever I go, since I'm from San Francisco, if I don't have something with a San Francisco sourdough starter in it, then people, I think they don't believe me. So we made a San Francisco pizza dough. And the characteristic of a San Francisco starter is that it has a real nice combination of lactic and acetic tang in it. So it's got a vinegar taste, and it's also got like a creamy kind of Greek yogurt flavor. And so the choice of goat's milk on Josh's side and reducing that down really linked everything else that went on the pizza with the flavors of the bread directly. The next course was a tartine. A tartine is a classic. It's like the French open-faced sandwich. And since this was just a couple weeks before Thanksgiving, I really pushed for having a turkey sandwich. So now the bread here is a pain au levain, which is the French version of a sourdough. It's a milder sour. It has more of the whole grain in it, and it brings a little bit more sweetness into the product. So Josh went from that by using, well, certainly the sweetness from the turkey itself, but also the turkey broth sauce, the kind of a Mornay velouté kind of combination, a creamy broth stock. And that really brought the sweetness out from the bread. And then again, you see the greens on there, and the greens were braised. When you braise greens, the bitterness is diminished, and you bring out the sweetness and the earthiness, which pairs back with the whole grain aspect that was in the bread. So this is a very, very intricate kind of a combination, and this is how chefs work. This is how they talk, and so but when people eat it, they like it. And so that was really my test of the whole thing. They might not understand the umami versus the cream and everything, but pretty much they licked their plates. So, and then the last thing on the menu was a porridge bread. And a porridge is literally, it's a cooked grain. And that grain can be cornmeal, as it is here, or it can be like risotto, or, I don't know, what's left over in the steam table after breakfast, like oatmeal or something like that, like a whole grain oatmeal porridge. Well, those porridges, once you cool them down, they're even warmed up, they're a storehouse of enzymes and flavor. So when you make particularly a sourdough or a wild yeast dough, as the dough is rising, you periodically fold this cooled porridge into the bread. So it brings to it enzymes which encourage the breakdown of the starches and the protein that are in the new flour in the bread. And of course, it brings all the flavor. The greatest advantage of this porridge bread technique is that these are like natural preservatives. I mean, the moisture that is given out over time inside these porridge breads gives these things a shelf life of 5 days, just right out on the counter. And certainly the crust will suffer, so you can refresh that by heating it. But inside the bread, it continues to be moist and tender and flavorful. And there is some anecdotal evidence now to the fact that the longer a natural yeast bread is allowed to ferment, once it's baked, the more flavor that develops in that as well. So it's kind of like just a storehouse of flavor and nutrition here. So that was the, pardon me, that was the last one we made. There was a fruit spread that went over top of that.
That's great. Michael, this is Sophie. I'm going to stop you there so we can leave the last 9 minutes for some audience questions and sharing.
Oh, sure.
I actually, in fact, perfect. So this is nicely done, Dara. These are the remark. I heard you laughing. If that's Maureen, is the absolutely remarkable sketch notes made by our very own Maureen Timmons. When I don't know the date of this. Recently,
This was in March of this year.
March, yeah, when she saw Michael speak. So. And I love the final example on the porridge bread. I actually had some porridge bread last night at a restaurant in San Francisco. It was the first time I've ever had porridge bread, and I really hope this takes off because the texture was phenomenal, and it was a really different kind of experience for me. But I love the interplay between your talk, Michael, on the flavor profiles and a whole language for describing the different flavors, and really a whole new way of thinking about bread, I think, and also just how that relates to higher nutritional quality that Jackie shared with us. So wanted to see if there are any questions from folks or any examples to share that kind of speak to these this example of menu that you provided of some of the great creative ways to get campus communities really excited about not only the nutritional value, but the deliciousness of these different whole grain offerings. Well, I have a question for Jackie and for you, Michael, both, which is, have you seen kind of a gateway whole grain? I mean, for those who maybe have a mental block for whole grain breads or intact grains, I mean, I have a hunch about what might be one that I've seen, but would love to hear your takes for, say, some of our MCURC members who are thinking, gosh, I'm just gonna have a really hard time getting my students really excited about, Levain or about Farro or what have you.
Wow. Sophie, I have an answer, but you can go first if you like.
Go ahead, Michael.
I'm sorry, Jackie.
Go ahead.
Okay, so my answer is I know several breads that could be a gateway bread, and I love that term. And I am happy to develop something that people could use in a like school or food service arrangement, and we can share that formula, and it can be anything from like a very simple like hamburger bun to like a sandwich bread or something like that. But no, I know several that are just really fun, and yes, and one of the tricks is to put a little bit of walnut oil into the bread, because that really accentuates the any graininess that's in there. And I know nuts are a allergen, but anyway, so that's what I say. I'm happy to do it.
All right, Jackie.
I think I kind of alluded to it in my presentation, but I have a husband who is maybe in that category, Sophie, that you described as being a little bit adverse to trying new things. And the millet was really a great gateway grain for him because he thinks it's couscous. So once I got him to try something new, and then after the fact told him, like, actually that's a whole grain, I kind of got him. And now he's much more open to trying some other new grains.
That's great. Yeah, I love that example. I think the reluctant husband is certainly relatable. True reluctant students, 18-year-olds not exactly jumping out of their seats about oatmeal. I did see somebody recently, maybe it was Northeastern even, that had a really fun oatmeal bar, which also made the option of kind of customization and build your own. So that seemed like a really great concept. And sorry, Northeastern, if I'm misremembering that, but I think that too, that sort of ownership and customization always is a great if not a gateway grain, a gateway framework. So we do have a question here from Dennis from Yukon. He'd like to know if either of you are seeing a greater move towards sprouted grain in breads.
Oh my gosh, absolutely, yes. And yes, there's a big movement on that, especially down in the Carolinas area. Peter Reinhardt is a noted baker and writer, and that is very specifically something that he's been promoting for a while. So, as a courtesy, I've kind of left that to him. But I sprout grains all the time. It makes them sweeter. It's something you can just fold into an existing white bread recipe that you have, especially for like hamburger buns or dinner rolls or something like that. And that might be a good gateway for for getting people to try whole grains, because it makes them sweeter.
Interesting. Well, and it seems like that's also why overnight oats are really exciting people, because of at least I've noticed it's just a completely more, yeah, it's more like cereal or something. It's much sweeter.
Yeah. And, okay, so and back to the other, like, what's a gateway thing? If you take whole ground grains, like whole wheat, not the like white flour with just like a little bit of whole wheat added into it, or whole grain, but pure whole grain flour, and you soak that overnight in an equal amount of water, it softens everything. It makes the green. It doesn't give breads that dry, kind of sandpapery feeling that a lot of people experience with whole wheat breads. And it also makes them sweeter. So you can take any recipe you have for white bread and just take, a third of the flour and a third of the water, and substitute it for whole ground grain and water soaked overnight, and then just put it in the next day. So wow, that's an easy fix as well.
I think that qualifies as a baking hack. That's a great, very handy tool to have.
A baking hack, okay.
We're just out of time, but I want to again thank everyone for taking the time to join us. If we don't talk to you before the end of the year, have a fabulous holiday season. Also really want to thank our speakers, Jackie Rotoldo, for emphasizing the powerful intersection of nutritious and delicious, and to Michael Calenti, who valiantly got the technology working, and I think we all, as Maureen Timmons' sketch note says, are now fully under the spell of yeast ourselves. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon, and we'll talk to you at our next webinar and throughout the Lunch and Learn and Latte and Learn series of 2018. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thank you.